Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. D Stories. I'm a storyteller. I know you watch this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Now close your eyes, quiet your mind, take a deep breath in, and slowly let it out. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Orlando, Florida, summer of 2001. The air was thick with humidity, a heavy blanket that settled over everything like the silence before a storm. I was a freelance journalist back then, working on a feature about urban redevelopment in downtown Orlando. That's how I first stumbled onto the name Michelle Witherell. At the time, I didn't know her story would pull me into something far more disturbing than any city planning controversy. It was a Tuesday morning in late July, when I first walked past the dilapidated apartment building on East Livingston Street. From the outside, it looked like just another rundown place, cracked windows, peeling paint, a sagging porch. Nothing remarkable. But behind one of those windows, something horrific had happened just a few months before, in December 2000, though the truth wouldn't come to light until the following year. Michelle Witherell had fallen from a third-story balcony. Her husband, Todd, said it was an accident, but rumors whispered something darker. At first, I didn't pay it much attention. I was focused on zoning codes and city council meetings. But when I mentioned that address to a contact at the Orlando Police Department, just in passing, he gave me a look I'll never forget. Like I'd said a cursed name. I asked what it was about, and he only said, "You want a real story? Look into Michelle Witherell." So I did. Her name didn't appear in many headlines. Just a brief obituary in the Orlando Sentinel, noting her death at age 29, survived by her husband. No mention of the fall. No mention of the bruises. It wasn't until I tracked down the medical examiner's report that I realized how wrong that obituary was. The document detailed a shattered jaw, a fractured skull, multiple injuries to her arms and legs, consistent with a fall, yes, but also with a possible assault beforehand. The report listed the cause of death as undetermined. I wanted answers. I started with the building itself. The apartment was boarded up by then. A local maintenance worker, Julio, who had worked there at the time, remembered the night she fell. It was around 11:30, he told me, lowering his voice like someone speaking of a haunting. I was smoking out back when I heard this thud. Not a scream, not a cry, just a thud. When I ran around to the front, she was just lying there. Her husband came out maybe a minute later. Didn't say a word, just stood there. Julio had told the police everything, but he said they didn't take it seriously. They said maybe she slipped, he told me. Maybe she jumped. But I knew enough about Michelle to question that. From talking to her friends, former co-workers at a daycare center where she'd worked, I learned she was quiet, kind, and creative. She painted in her spare time. She wasn't the type to leap off a balcony. Her best friend, Katie Morales, cried when I mentioned Michelle's name. I told her to leave him, she said. He was controlling, angry, the kind of man who wants to own you. The deeper I went, the darker it became. I wasn't just writing a story anymore. I was standing at the edge of something rotten that had festered beneath the surface for far too long, and I was about to step into it. I still remember the first time I saw Todd Witherell in person. He didn't know I was watching him. It was mid-August 2001, a scorching day even by Florida standards. I had driven out to a small neighborhood just east of Orlando, where he was now living with a new girlfriend. I parked 2 houses down and watched from my car. He looked ordinary, not the type you'd expect to be wrapped in whispers of death. Medium build, clean-shaven, dark polo shirt, and jeans. He moved like a man without worry. That bothered me. Michelle had been dead for 8 months, and yet he looked untouched. I had gone through the public court records by then. There were no charges filed, no official suspicion. The case had been left open, but inactive. The Orlando Police Department had quietly moved on. From the outside, Michelle's death had all the marks of a tragic accident. But from within, inside the seams of the story, it didn't sit right. Not for her friends, not for the people in that building, and certainly not for me. I tracked down the paramedics who responded that night. One of them, an older guy named Marcus, agreed to meet me behind a diner on Colonial Drive. We sat in his truck, engine humming with the ASC running full blast. He didn't waste time. She was already gone when we got there, he said, eyes locked straight ahead. But what I remember, more than anything, was her face. There was a bruise on her jaw, fresh. Not from the fall. A punch, maybe. And her teeth, some of them were broken. Could that have happened from hitting the pavement? I asked. He shook his head. You fall on your back, you break your skull. On your legs, your ankles shatter. But your face? You'd have to fall face first with force. It didn't look like that. It looked personal. That word again. Personal. I asked him if he reported it. He nodded. To the officer on scene. I said, this doesn't look like just a fall. He wrote it down. But that was it. No follow-up. Nothing. I left that meeting with my stomach in knots. If the responding medical team had flagged it, why had the case stalled? I started digging into the detective assigned to the original investigation. His name was Sergeant Ron Kessler, a 20-year veteran of the force. I left messages, 3 of them. No reply. Then I showed up at his office. He was polite but cold. There was no evidence of foul play, he said flatly. We interviewed the husband. Toxicology came back clean. There was no suicide note, but no signs of forced entry or a struggle in the apartment. The injuries were consistent with a fall. But the bruises? I asked. Bruising happens in falls, especially with multiple impact points. He stood to end the conversation. Look, I know people want someone to blame, but sometimes accidents really are just accidents. It felt rehearsed, like something he'd said 100 times. Still, I thanked him and walked out. I sat in my car for a while, hands on the wheel, staring out across the parking lot. The more I looked into Michelle's story, the more I saw how easily people disappear. Not just physically, but from the system itself. A young woman dies under suspicious circumstances, and because there's no gun, no knife, no eyewitness, the case falls into a gray area. And in that gray area, predators thrive. I wasn't sure what my next step should be. The trail was going cold, and I was starting to feel the weight of pushing too hard. But then, something changed everything. Katie Morales, the friend who had cried in front of me, called late that night. Her voice was shaking. She'd remembered something Michelle told her just weeks before she died. She said, if anything ever happened to her, I should check the closet. I asked, what closet? The hallway closet in their apartment. She said she kept a diary hidden behind the vent panel. Said Todd would never find it. I felt a jolt of adrenaline. That apartment had been boarded up for months. But I knew a guy in building maintenance, Julio. Maybe, just maybe, the closet was still there. And maybe so was Michelle's voice. The next morning, I called Julio before the sun was fully up. I caught him on his way to the building. He still did part-time maintenance there, though the 3rd floor had been mostly abandoned. When I explained what I was looking for, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I remember that closet, he finally said. I sealed up the vents after the fall. The whole hallway was leaking air. You think the diary's still there? I don't know, I said. But if it is, it could tell us what really happened to Michelle. He paused. Meet me there in an hour. I arrived early and waited in my car, engine off, windows cracked. It was already getting warm, the heat rising from the cracked pavement like waves. The building was worse than I remembered. Chipped stucco, graffiti tagging the stairwells, dead palm fronds piled along the entrance. A place forgotten by the city. Forgotten like Michelle. Julio showed up in a battered red Ford pickup, toolbox in the back. He gave me a tight nod and walked me inside. The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dim. Half the bulbs had burned out and hadn't been replaced in months. Michelle and Todd's apartment was the last one on the left. Julio pulled a ring of keys from his belt and unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like mildew that had crept into the carpet and refused to leave. The living room was empty except for a broken chair and a stained mattress pushed against the wall. But my eyes were locked on the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. We walked in silence to the closet. It was a small linen closet just outside the master bedroom. Julio knelt down and ran his fingers along the lower vent panel. This one, he said. I remember covering it, but I didn't use screws. Just slid it back into place. He pried it off gently and reached inside. For a moment, nothing. Then his hand stopped. He pulled out a small, cloth-bound journal, faded green, its edges frayed like it had been handled often. There was a single elastic loop holding it shut. It looked untouched by time, but I felt my heart racing like I was holding evidence from a cold crime scene. Michelle's voice, locked in these pages, waiting to be heard. I thanked Julio. He didn't ask questions, just nodded again and left. I stood alone in the dead hallway, holding the journal against my chest, before walking back to my car. Once inside, I sat in the driver's seat and took a breath. Then I opened it. The first page was dated July 3rd, 2000. Neat handwriting. Slanted, a little nervous. She began with a simple line. "I'm not sure why I'm writing this, but I need someone to hear me, even if it's just the paper." The entries were scattered at first. Notes about her job at the daycare. Her love of painting. A description of the mural she had started painting in the living room. Birds in flight across a sky. But by late August, the tone shifted. August 21st, 2000. Todd screamed at me today because I forgot to set the timer on the coffee machine. I tried to explain, but he got so close to my face I could feel him breathing. I thought he might hit me, but he didn't. Not yet. I keep telling myself it's just stress. September 2nd, 2000. He did hit me this time. Just once, in the kitchen. I told Katie I slipped. I lied because I didn't want her to worry. I'm scared she'll make me leave. I'm scared of what he'll do if I try. I felt sick reading it. The entries continued, each one more haunting than the last. Michelle documented everything, the cycles of abuse, the threats, her own internal battles over whether to leave. But the most chilling entry came just weeks before her death. November 29th, 2000. I caught him watching me while I slept. Just standing there, staring. He said nothing. I asked what he was doing, and he smiled. Just smiled. I think something is breaking in him. Or maybe in me. If anything happens to me, check the closet. Please. I don't want to disappear. I closed the journal slowly, my hands trembling. Michelle hadn't just fallen. She had predicted something, feared something. She left behind a record not only of her pain, but of her premonition. I knew now I couldn't walk away from this. Not with this journal in my hand. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Todd was free. No charges. No police interest. But what I had was more than emotion. It was testimony. Her words. Her timeline. The next step was to find someone who could help me reopen her case. And I knew just the person. Her name was Lena Marshall, and she was no stranger to shadows. Lena had spent 13 years in the Orange County State Attorney's office, first as a prosecutor, then as a victims' rights advocate. She had a reputation, stubborn, relentless, and deeply feared in court by anyone on the wrong side of justice. I'd met her once, 2 years earlier, while covering a case involving the wrongful imprisonment of a local teenager. She dismantled the police's case on the stand and got him exonerated. That trial stuck with me, not just because of the outcome, but because of her ferocity. If anyone could help bring Michelle's story into the light, it was Lena. I reached her office on a Thursday morning. Her assistant told me she was booked solid for the next week, but when I mentioned Michelle Witherell's name, there was a pause on the other end. The voice dropped to a whisper. "Come at 4 p.m. today. She'll wait." I arrived early, the journal wrapped in brown paper, and tucked into my satchel like sacred evidence. Lena's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building near the courthouse, minimalist and cold, save for a single black and white photo of a courthouse gavel hanging crooked on the wall. When she entered, Lena didn't offer a handshake. She dropped a leather folder on the desk and leaned back in her chair, watching me like a prosecutor watches a hostile witness. "You've got 10 minutes, she said. "Start talking." I did. I told her everything, Michelle's fall, the suspicious bruises, Todd's indifference, and the diary. I laid the journal on her desk like a loaded weapon. She didn't touch it at first, just stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, she opened the cover and flipped to the later entries. I watched her eyes move. I watched the color drain from her face. "You said this was hidden?" she asked. "Yes. In the vent of the hallway closet." Her friend Katie told me Michelle said to check there, if anything happened. Lena flipped more pages, then stopped. She reread something twice, silently. Her fingers tightened on the spine. "She was asking for help," she said softly. "And no one listened." I nodded. "Can we reopen the case?" Lena didn't answer immediately. She stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the courthouse across the street. "I'm not law enforcement," she said. "I can't reopen anything, but I can take this to someone who might." She turned back to me. "The only problem is, if the department marked the death as undetermined and closed the case as inactive, they'll need new evidence to justify a full reopening. The diary might not be enough, especially if there's no forensics tied to it. The husband can just say she was delusional, emotional, dramatic. Courts don't like emotions." "She was scared," I said. "She was being abused." "She was," Lena agreed. "But fear doesn't convict someone." She tapped the cover of the journal. "But a timeline might." She pulled her own notepad and began sketching dates, drawing a pattern. August, September, November. We worked backward from Michelle's notes, each entry naming a fight, a bruise, a strange behavior. If we could cross-reference the dates with calls to 911, police records, even witness statements from neighbors, we might be able to show a pattern of escalating abuse. And Lena had access to those records. "Give me 48 hours," she said. "I'll see what still exists. If anything connects, even one call, one report, I'll go to internal affairs myself. You stay quiet. Don't confront him. Don't go back to the apartment. If Todd catches wind of this, he'll bury anything we haven't already found." That night, I didn't sleep. I kept rereading the last few entries of Michelle's diary. Her fear was so present, so raw, it clung to the air around me. It wasn't just dread, it was prophecy. She knew what was coming, and in the end, her words reached out like a lifeline. By morning, I had a voicemail from Lena. "I found something," she said. A call made from the apartment on September 3rd. Domestic disturbance. Police responded. No arrest. But get this, Michelle had a bruised lip. Said she walked into a door. The officer didn't take a statement, but he filed the call under non-criminal. My breath caught. "That's our crack," Lena continued. "We show it wasn't an isolated incident. We link the bruises on her body with the journal. We show that she predicted what happened. We bring that timeline to internal affairs and press for a reinvestigation. We do this right, and we might not just reopen the case, we might get a warrant." For the first time since I opened that diary, I felt something unfamiliar. Hope. But it wouldn't last long. Because Todd Witherell had secrets, too, and he had already started to suspect someone was digging. It began with a knock. A sharp, deliberate knock on my apartment door at 6:42 p.m., 2 nights after I spoke with Lena. I hadn't told anyone where I lived. My name wasn't listed on the buzzer. No one ever just showed up. I froze for a moment, hand hovering above my laptop, the cursor blinking on a half-written paragraph about Michelle's final days. The knock came again, this time slower. I stepped to the peephole. A man stood there, stocky, broad-shouldered, wearing a collared shirt that clung tightly around his neck. He had thinning blonde hair and pale skin that seemed to flush red under the porch light. I didn't recognize him, but my gut clenched anyway. He didn't knock a third time. He just stood there, breathing through his nose, almost rhythmically. Then, as if he knew I was watching, he turned his head slightly and smiled. That smile. I'd seen it before. Page 38 of Michelle's diary, dated November 29th. I asked what he was doing, and he smiled. Just smiled. I stepped back, locked the deadbolt. He didn't try the door. He didn't speak. Just turned and walked away. Calm. Measured. Like a man finishing an errand. I waited 5 full minutes before I opened the door. He was gone. No note, no sign of damage, no threat. Just a silent message. "I know where you live." I called Lena immediately. "You sure it was him?" she asked. "No doubt," I said. I didn't recognize the face from photos, but that smile. Michelle described it. "It's not something you forget." Lena cursed under her breath. "This changes things. He knows you're involved now. And if he's watching you, he might know about the diary. You need to get out of your apartment. Tonight." "I'm not running. This isn't running. This is surviving," she snapped. "Let me make some calls." 10 minutes later, she had me booked into a hotel on her firm's emergency account. Room 207 at the Holiday Plaza off Semerin Boulevard. Nothing fancy, but quiet and secure. I packed only what I needed, my recorder, my notes, and Michelle's diary. Everything else could burn. I arrived at the hotel around 9 p.m., the sun long gone, the night humid and choked with the sound of crickets. I checked in under the name she'd arranged, David Ellis. The clerk didn't even blink. I went straight to my room and locked the door, sliding the bolt and shoving a chair beneath the handle for good measure. Lena called again at 9:45. Her voice was sharper now, more urgent. "I did more digging," she said. The September 3rd police call wasn't the only one. There was another. October 11th. No report filed, but a unit responded. The notes say verbal dispute. No visible injuries. But listen to this. On that same night, a neighbor from across the hall called 911 again 20 minutes later. Reported hearing a scream and what sounded like glass breaking. The second call was dismissed, marked as duplicate. No officer was sent back. So there was a pattern, I said. She was in danger, and they ignored her. Lena exhaled. And now, someone's trying to keep that pattern buried. The next day, we met at her office again. She laid out the timeline. 4 distinct events, all corroborated by Michelle's journal, building up to her death on December 3rd. We had the diary. We had police call logs. We had a neighbor willing to testify that she heard abuse, Katie Morales. And now we had the possibility of witness intimidation. My visit from Todd wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a legal mistake. Lena drafted a formal request to the Orlando Police Department's Internal Affairs Division to reopen the Michelle Witherell case. She filed it at 3:17 p.m. on August 19, 2001. At 4:06 p.m., I got a voicemail from an unknown number. A man's voice. Calm. Measured. You don't know what you're doing. You think you're helping her. You're not. Let it go. No name. No threats. Just a statement. I played it for Lena. She stared at the speaker, face unreadable. Didn't come from his phone, she said. Probably a burner. But it's enough to file a report. We did. That night, I lay in the dark of the hotel room, unable to sleep. The air conditioner hummed above me. Outside, the occasional whoosh of passing cars echoed off the parking lot. I held Michelle's diary in my hands, flipping through the entries once more. I kept thinking about the last page. December 2nd, 2000. He told me he loved me today. Then he grabbed my wrist so hard I cried out. Said I make him crazy. Said he couldn't live without me. I think he means it. I think I'm in danger. It was the last thing she ever wrote. And now it was my turn to finish the story she started. Because Michelle hadn't just fallen. She had been pushed. And I was going to prove it. The following morning, Orlando's sky was smeared gray with the kind of clouds that hang heavy and motionless, like they're waiting for something terrible to happen. I sat across from Lena in the conference room of her office, both of us nursing lukewarm coffee. She looked more tired than usual, her blazer wrinkled, hair pulled into a rushed bun, the legal pads before her covered in red ink scribbles. They've acknowledged receipt of the reinvestigation request, she said without looking up. But they're stalling. No formal statement. Just a memo saying they'll review the supplemental evidence for procedural viability. Meaning they're deciding if it's worth their time, or if it makes them look bad. Internal affairs? Lena scoffed. They don't like reopening cases that make their officers look lazy. Or worse. I rubbed my temples. So what happens now? We take it to the court of public opinion, she said. Your words. Your platform. You're a journalist. You write. We make Michelle's story impossible to ignore. It was a risk. If we went public, Todd would know everything. He'd know we had the diary. He'd know we were linking police negligence with his abuse. And if he was already willing to show up at my door once, what would stop him from doing something worse? But the alternative was silence. And Michelle had been silenced long enough. That evening, I began writing the article. It wasn't just a piece, it was an expose. A full timeline of Michelle Witherell's final 4 months. Her abuse, the ignored warning signs, the calls that went unanswered, the bruises left undocumented. And threaded throughout were quotes from her own journal, her own words, written in quiet terror. I called it, The Fall That Should Have Been Heard, The Forgotten Death of Michelle Witherell. The article was published online at 11:43 a.m. on August 23rd. It spread faster than we could have imagined. Within hours, the piece had been picked up by 3 local news stations, then syndicated by the Florida State Dispatch. By midnight, national outlets had reached out for interviews. Comment sections exploded. Hashtags formed. Hashtag justice for Michelle. Hashtag she did not fall. Hashtag believe her diary. But with attention came consequence. By the next morning, my email was flooded with threats. Most anonymous. Some disturbingly detailed. One simply read, "You were warned." But then came a message I hadn't expected. It was from a former neighbor of the Witherells, a woman named Diana Kramer. She had lived in the same building, 1 floor down, apartment 203. Her message was short. I read your article. I have something you need to hear. I've kept quiet for too long. Lena and I met her that afternoon at a coffee shop just off Colonial Drive. Diana was in her late 50s, hair tied back, eyes deeply set with guilt and fear. She shook my hand with both of hers. I used to hear them fight, she said. It wasn't just shouting. I heard things breaking. One night, I heard her scream, and then silence. I called management. They told me not to get involved. Said they'd handle it internally. She paused. That was October. But it got worse after that. Around Thanksgiving, I saw her on the stairs. Her eye was swollen shut. She was carrying a small bag, like she was trying to leave. Did she say anything to you? Lena asked gently. She looked right at me, Diana said, voice trembling. I said, "Are you all right?" And she whispered, "I'm not safe." That's all. Then she walked back upstairs. Did you ever tell anyone? I asked. No. I was afraid. I thought maybe it was over when she died. I figured it wasn't my business anymore. But now, she swallowed hard. Now I know she was asking for help. Lena pressed her hand over Diana's. We can include your statement in our affidavit. It strengthens the abuse timeline. If you're willing, you could testify if this goes to trial. Diana nodded slowly. I am. It's too late for her. But it's not too late for the truth. That evening, I updated the article. I added Diana's statement. I added a new section, Witnesses Speak, and included Michelle's final journal entry in full. By morning, everything changed. The Orlando Police Department announced the formal reopening of the Michelle Witherell case. The press release was clinical, but buried in the second paragraph was the sentence we'd been waiting for. New evidence has surfaced suggesting that Michelle Witherell's death may have involved foul play. The department has appointed a special investigator to re-examine the case. They didn't name Todd. They didn't mention the abuse. But behind the scenes, Lena confirmed something big. They were preparing to question him formally. He's panicking, she told me over the phone that night. His lawyer's already been in touch with the department. They're trying to get ahead of it. That same night, my phone buzzed with a private number. I answered it out of instinct, a voice I now recognized too well. You think this is justice? Todd Witherell said calmly. You think dragging my name through the dirt brings her back? I said nothing. He chuckled softly. You don't know me. You think you've seen the monster, but you haven't. She made me this way. Then he hung up. I sat frozen for nearly a minute, staring at the blank call screen. He wasn't just trying to intimidate anymore. He was unraveling, and that meant he might finally slip up. We were closer than ever, but we'd have to move fast, because monsters, when cornered, don't beg. They bite. By the morning of August 26th, Orlando had become a city on edge, at least in the corners where Michelle Witherell's name still lingered like smoke. Local news anchors spoke about her with a sudden solemnity. Protesters with hand-painted signs began to gather outside the police department downtown, some holding photos of Michelle's face beside the words, "She deserved to be heard." Lena and I met again at her office, the mood sharper now, heavier. They've assigned an internal investigator, she said, sliding a file across the table. Name's Ronald Eames. Former homicide. Quiet reputation. Detail-oriented. Not afraid to ruffle feathers. I opened the folder. A gray-haired man with cold, intelligent eyes looked back at me from a grainy ID photo. Eames had reportedly spent years in narcotics and homicide before being rotated into internal affairs. His job wasn't to play politics. It was to root out rot. He contacted me last night, Lena said. Wants to meet. Just the three of us. When? In an hour. The meeting was held in a back conference room inside the OPD's auxiliary building, far from the public eye. The walls were cinderblock painted beige, the table scratched by years of elbows and pens. Eames entered at 11:02 a.m., right on the dot, a man who clearly didn't waste time on ceremony. Let's get to it, he said, sitting across from us with a small notepad. I've read the journal. I've seen the articles. Tell me what you think happened. Lena looked at me. I nodded, and I told the story again. From the beginning. The bruises, the diary, the 911 calls, the ignored reports, the threats. I spoke for 37 minutes without interruption. When I was done, Eames tapped his pen once against the pad and finally said, There's enough here to suggest Michelle Witherell's death was not accidental. Then he leaned in, his eyes narrowing. But here's what concerns me, the original autopsy report. I blinked. What about it? It was rushed, he said. The pathologist listed the manner of death as undetermined, but made no mention of inconsistencies with the fall pattern. No bone trauma inconsistent with a self-inflicted jump. No deep tissue analysis for bruising beneath the visible injuries. And no photos were taken of her hands. Why her hands? I asked. Because if she'd fallen on her own, she would have tried to break the fall. Even a reflexive response creates stress fractures in the wrists or hands. The absence of that would suggest she didn't fall. She was pushed. Lena leaned forward. Can the body be exhumed? Eames nodded. Already requested. Quietly. Judge signed the order this morning. My heart skipped. And the husband? We're watching him, Eames said. But he's already talking. Not to us, but to others. Asking questions. Moving money. We believe he may attempt to flee. Lena's mouth tightened. Then you'll issue a warrant? When the forensics come back, he said. We need one last thing to seal it. What? Intent. He looked at me directly now. Is there anything in that diary, anything, that indicates he planned this? I hesitated. Michelle wrote about the fear, about him saying she couldn't leave, about how he'd rather die than see her walk out the door. She described threats, but nothing direct. Eames tapped his pen again. We may need more. That afternoon, I went back to the apartment building. I know, Lena would have killed me if she knew. But something had been gnawing at me since I first read Michelle's final entries. A missing thread, a silence between the lines. Her last note had been written on December 2nd, but there was something else, something that didn't fit. Michelle was meticulous in her writing. She always dated her entries. But one page, toward the middle of the journal, was ripped out. A small tear, barely noticeable, right after an entry dated October 27th. I hadn't thought much of it before. Now I did. I made my way up to apartment 3B. The door was locked, of course. Someone else lived there now, a couple who knew nothing about the woman who died on their balcony. But the building's superintendent, an old man named Dennis, remembered. Michelle, he said when I asked. Yeah, nice girl. Quiet. Shame what happened. Do you remember if she ever reported anything about Todd? Dennis looked uncomfortable. She came down once, a few weeks before she died. Said she'd lost a key and needed the locks changed. Wanted her own set. Said it was urgent. He rubbed his jaw. She looked scared, like someone had been in her place without her knowing. He paused. I told her I'd come by the next day. But I didn't. We were short-staffed. I asked him if he still had access to the old mailboxes. He did. In the dusty basement behind two locked doors were the old letterboxes that hadn't been cleared since the new tenants moved in. Dennis handed me a bundle of yellowed envelopes, most addressed to Todd. And in the back of box 3B, folded into a creased envelope with no stamp, I found it. A torn page. October 28, 2000. It read, he says I belong to him. That if I ever leave, no one will find me. He was holding something today. I think it was a wire. I asked what it was and he said, insurance. I think he's planning something. I think he wants it to look like an accident. My hands were shaking as I read it. It wasn't just fear. It was a prediction. And now we had what Eames needed. Intent. We were done speculating. Michelle Witherell didn't fall. She was murdered, and her killer had written his own confession through her hands. The page from October 28th was still trembling in my fingers as I left the basement. I called Lena before I even reached my car. We have it, I said. We have intent. We have everything. Her voice came through the phone like a fire catching oxygen. You're absolutely sure? I have it in front of me. She wrote it. She knew. She knew. He was planning it. She said he wanted it to look like an accident. Lena didn't hesitate. Get to my office. Now. 37 minutes later, we sat with Eames again, this time with the page sealed in a plastic evidence pouch, photographed and documented. He read it slowly, lips moving, eyes tracking each word like they were landmines. This changes the entire prosecutorial scope, he said, almost under his breath. He stood up, made a single phone call, and within 15 minutes we were joined by an assistant state attorney, a sharp woman named Carolyn Vega. She was brisk, skeptical, and asked for everything. Handwriting analysis, provenance, Michelle's full diary, the 911 logs, witness affidavits, even audio from Todd's previous voicemail threats. I handed it all over. You're building a case for second-degree murder, Vega said as she took notes. Premeditation, coercive control, intent, and prior abuse. But you're also building something else, an indictment of this department's past failures. I'm aware, Eames said, no hesitation. Vega nodded. Then we do this by the book. I'll file a petition for a grand jury review within 48 hours. If the forensics from the exhumation corroborate blunt force inconsistencies, and this new page is authenticated, we move to arrest. It was happening. It was real. After almost a year of silence and decay, Michelle's voice was becoming louder than ever. That night, I returned to the hotel. I stared at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. It was a strange kind of anticipation. Not joy, not fear, but the tension of a long-dead truth preparing to rise. At 2:09 a.m., my phone buzzed. Another unknown number. I answered it out of reflex. But this time, there was no voice. Just silence. Then a low, mechanical hum, feedback, maybe, or something being recorded. And then, click. I stared at the phone for a long time after that. The next day, Lena and I kept things quiet. We didn't want to alert Todd that the net was closing. But of course, he already knew. At 3:43 p.m. on August 28, Todd Witherell walked into the downtown Orlando police station with his lawyer. Not to confess, not to talk, but to file a restraining order against me. He claimed harassment, defamation, and ongoing threats to his personal safety. He cited my article, Lena's legal motion, and even the Twitter posts from protesters outside his condo as evidence. He's not scared, Lena said when she heard the news. He's trying to play the victim. Typical narcissist defense. But Eames saw it differently. He's scared, he said. He knows we're close, and this is a last-ditch attempt to muddy the waters before we strike. The next morning, the forensic report came in. Michelle's wrists showed no signs of defensive fractures. There were unexplained contusions on the upper arms, consistent with someone being grabbed and shoved. And microscopic analysis showed early-stage bruising, meaning she was still alive when the trauma occurred, but not for long. She didn't jump, Vega said. She was pushed. From behind. At 6:12 p.m., August 30th, 2001, an arrest warrant was issued for Todd Witherell on charges of second-degree murder, domestic battery, and obstruction of justice. They waited for him at his home. But he wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere. He had vanished. The panic spread fast. By nightfall, Orlando PD had issued a bolo. Be on the lookout for his black 1998 Ford Taurus. His bank accounts had been emptied. His phone turned off. His apartment abandoned. Keys left in the door like a final middle finger to the system that had finally caught up to him. I sat with Lena in silence as we watched the news report. A blurry image of Todd's last known location, a gas station outside Apopka, flickered on the screen. "He won't get far," she said. "He's not smart enough to disappear forever." I nodded, but deep inside I wasn't sure. Because men like Todd, men who live in control, who manipulate, isolate, and gaslight, they don't see the world like we do. They think they're owed safety, that consequences are for other people. And when the walls finally close in, they don't always go quietly. That night, I opened Michelle's diary one last time. I flipped to that final page. Her handwriting, shaky but certain, told a story that had taken us nearly a year to understand. But we understood now, and the world did too. Still, justice wasn't complete. Not yet. Not until we found him. The manhunt for Todd Witherell began quietly, without the fanfare you might expect for a suspected murderer. No helicopters, no dogs, no news conferences. Just a rapidly mobilized fugitive task force, unmarked vehicles, and a stack of warrants that would grow thicker by the hour. He had slipped through the cracks before. But this time, we knew what kind of cracks to look for. Eames called me the next morning, terse as ever. He had help, he said. His cousin wired him money from a burner account. He's heading north, possibly into Georgia. Is the FBI involved yet? They will be by the end of today. I've submitted the federal warrant. Lena stood in my office when I hung up the call, arms crossed. What happens if they don't catch him? I asked. She answered without blinking. We don't stop. I went back to my notes, back to Michelle's diary, back to every line I had underlined, every piece I hadn't published. I was looking for something, anything, he might be using to stay ahead of the law. A cabin? A friend from college? A getaway plan? That's when I saw it. In an entry dated September 14, 2000, Michelle had written, "He still talks about his uncle's place up in Tennessee. Says it's where he used to hide when he skipped school. No one knows it's there," he said once. He was proud of that, of being invisible. I showed the passage to Eames immediately. He wasted no time. By that afternoon, a U.S. Marshal team was dispatched to a derelict hunting cabin in rural Cumberland County, Tennessee. An area thick with pine, no cell signal, and one road in or out. The cabin hadn't been used in years. Except now. There were recent tire tracks in the mud. A torn receipt from an Orlando gas station, dated 4 days earlier. And inside, under a pile of flannel blankets, a worn backpack with Todd's initials stitched into the lining. But Todd wasn't there. He had moved again, barely ahead of them. This time it felt different. It wasn't just about evading law enforcement. Todd was unraveling. Running not just from justice, but from the inevitable collapse of the world he'd built. The control he had lost. The illusion he no longer owned. He was desperate. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 2001, a break came not from investigators, but from a gas station clerk just outside Knoxville. He remembered a man matching Todd's description. He was nervous, the clerk said. Kept his head down. Paid with cash. Bought a burner phone and a six-pack. I remember, 'cause he asked if anyone had come in asking about him. The surveillance footage was grainy, but clear enough. It was Todd. He was wearing the same jacket he'd last been seen in. The manhunt intensified. Lena and I waited in the purgatory of breaking news alerts, short phone calls, and endless hours of nothing. For days, we slept in shifts. Every vibration from my phone sent my stomach twisting into knots. Then, on the night of September 5th, at 11:42 p.m., my phone rang again. Eames. They've got him. I didn't speak, couldn't breathe. They found him outside Chattanooga, walking along a back road, headed toward a Greyhound station. We think he was trying to get to Kentucky. He didn't resist. Lena, sitting across from me, exhaled so sharply it sounded like a sob. Was he armed? I asked. No. He was tired. Looked like he hadn't slept in days. Told the officer who cuffed him, "You don't know what you're doing." That was all he said. By morning, the news had broken nationwide. Fugitive husband of Michelle Witherell arrested in Tennessee. Justice after 9 months, Todd Witherell in custody. From tragedy to indictment, the case that changed Orlando. But inside the small courtroom in downtown Orlando where Todd was arraigned just days later, there was no fanfare. Just steel cuffs, tired faces, and Michelle's parents sitting in the second row, hands clenched together so tightly their knuckles turned white. When Todd was asked to enter a plea, he looked directly at the judge and said, "Not guilty." His voice was flat, empty, like a puppet reading lines. The trial would come next. But already, the foundation had shifted. Michelle's death was no longer an accident, no longer forgotten. Her name was being spoken in homes, in schools, in police precincts. Her diary was being used in training seminars for domestic violence response. Lena had already been contacted to consult on proposed legislation, Michelle's Law, that would strengthen state requirements for police follow-up on domestic abuse calls. And as I stood outside the courthouse that morning, the sun finally breaking through a stretch of gray September sky, I realized something. We hadn't just told her story. We had amplified it. Todd tried to erase her. But now, her truth was louder than his lies. And he would never outrun it again. The trial began in late October 2001, inside a packed courtroom at the Orange County Courthouse. The atmosphere was tense. Families, journalists, and local residents filled every seat. The air was thick with anticipation and an undercurrent of grief that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The prosecution, led by Carolyn Vega, was relentless. She presented the diary entries, forensic reports, and witness testimonies with precision. The page I'd found, the one where Michelle described Todd's threats and the insurance wire, was a centerpiece of their case. "You see," Vega told the jury, "this was no accident. This was calculated. Todd Witherell planned to kill his wife and make it look like a fall. His motive? Control. Fear of losing her. The destruction of a life that wasn't his to claim." The defense painted a different picture. They portrayed Todd as a grieving husband, overwhelmed by loss and confusion. They claimed the diary was exaggerated, the bruises self-inflicted, the death a tragic accident born from despair. But as the trial unfolded, the evidence was damning. Michelle's friends testified about her increasing fear in the months before her death, the isolation Todd had imposed, and the late-night calls where she begged for help. The police officers who initially responded to her 911 calls admitted to being pressured by superiors to downgrade the reports. The final witness was Ronald Eames. His testimony was a meticulous breakdown of the forensic findings, emphasizing the inconsistencies in the original investigation and the undeniable signs of assault. On November 15, 2001, after 3 weeks of testimony and hours of jury deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty of second-degree murder. Todd Witherell's face remained blank as the judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison, with eligibility for parole only after 20. As the gavel fell, Michelle's family wept openly. Lena and I exchanged a look, exhausted but resolute. The truth had prevailed. In the months that followed, Michelle's case became a catalyst for change in Orlando and beyond. Police training programs were revised to better handle domestic violence cases. Victim advocacy groups saw an increase in funding and public support, and the memory of Michelle Witherell became a rallying cry for those fighting against domestic abuse. For me, the journey was transformative. I had stepped into a story that was much larger than a single tragedy. It was about systemic failure, about the silent suffering of countless victims, and about the power of persistence. Years later, I returned to Orlando. Standing near the balcony where Michelle's life had ended, I felt a quiet resolve. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of us, and it would never be forgotten. Story 2. March 1st, 1992. The humid Charlotte night clings heavy. I pull into a rundown Taco Bell on Eastland Mall Boulevard, parking in a lot lit harsh by sodium lights. On the shift is Henry Louis Wallace, late 20s, wearing a name tag and a practiced smile. He strides past, masculine confidence in every step. He's not just staff, he's the manager. I clock his watchful gaze over the crew, a few young black women trying to juggle orders and smiling customers. It's around midnight, most patrons gone. What I don't know yet, Henry just finished killing his first victim in Barnwell, South Carolina 4 days earlier. A hush of dread, carried on the smell of burritos and fryer oil. 2 months later, early May 1992, the body of Sharon Nance, 33, is found off railroad tracks near I-85. Charlotte officers pieced together CCTV from near Taco Bell. Sharon, a known sex worker, was last seen with someone who fit Henry's description. He denies meeting her. Crime scene teams dust for prints, but nothing links yet. June 15, 1992. Caroline Love, 20, a Bojangles employee and roommate of Henry's girlfriend, vanishes. She bought quarters for laundry after her shift and disappeared. Her bed sheets gone. The apartment shows signs of a struggle. 2 days later, missing person file opened and closed due to workload. Weeks later, her skeletal body is found in a wooded area. Cause of death, strangulation. No immediate suspect. Late that summer, word hits the homicide unit. A pattern. Young black women in East Charlotte, all strangled, neatly arranged scenes, little sign of forced entry. But resources? Thin. Detectives admit later, we were overwhelmed. The first 3 murders are so scattered, link analysis doesn't kick in. Meanwhile, I keep tabs on Henry. He's cordial, a bit too calm. He even opens a door for me, jokes about sitting orders. No hint of the darkness he carries. That was Charlotte in spring, summer 1992. Booming business, crime mounting 0.9K violent incidents annually, nearly 90 murders a year. Yet these weren't on the radar. Kitchen talk at Taco Bell. He's a good boss. But I sensed something darker in the underbelly of East Charlotte. By the fall of 1992, I found myself chasing threads that felt like whispers in the dark. The murders hadn't made front-page news, not really. Not like they would have if the victims had been white. The city, for all its growth, was still deeply fractured along racial lines. The police? They were underfunded, overworked, and to be honest, overwhelmed. 3 dead black women in Charlotte didn't stir the same urgency that a single suburban homicide might. But I kept asking questions. I started digging. That fall, I interviewed the family of Caroline Love, her mother, her sister, and friends from Bojangles where she worked. They told me Caroline was warm-hearted, reliable, and deeply rooted in her church. She wasn't the kind of woman to vanish into the night. Her mother sat with me on her porch, chain-smoking, staring at nothing. "It don't make sense," she kept saying. "My girl ain't just gone." The more I listened, the more the pattern took shape. The women were all young, all black. Many knew each other or lived in the same neighborhoods. Most had some connection, however slight, to Henry Louis Wallace. But back then, Wallace's name wasn't even in my notebook. In November 1992, I was called to another scene. A small apartment near North Sharon Amity Road. A 21-year-old named Shauna Hawk had been found by her mother in the bathtub, her body still warm, submerged in water that had long gone cold. There were bruises around her neck. No signs of forced entry. No valuables missing. I stood outside while the coroner's van backed up the driveway. The mother's screams echoed out into the night, a sound so raw it made my teeth hurt. Another young woman, another unanswered question. Police chalked it up to a robbery gone wrong, maybe someone she knew. There was talk of a jealous ex-boyfriend. No arrests were made. Weeks passed. The papers moved on. But I didn't. Something about the neatness of it all didn't sit right with me. These weren't chaotic crimes. They were deliberate, quiet, personal, and the killer wasn't leaving a trail, not a clear one anyway. But I noticed something. All the women had been strangled, no weapons used. Just hands. Whoever did this didn't just want them dead. He wanted to feel it. That's when I started asking around the Taco Bell. I spoke with a cashier who asked to remain anonymous. She'd worked nights under Wallace and remembered him well, too well. He was nice, she said. Almost too nice. You know the type. Always asking personal questions. Always trying to be there when you were alone. At first it felt kind. Later it felt off. When I pressed further, she told me he knew Shauna. She'd worked at the Taco Bell too briefly. He'd even attended her funeral. Stood beside her grieving mother. Said kind words. Comforted her. A chill crept through me. A man who could kill you and hug your mother at your funeral? That was no ordinary murderer. That was a predator hiding in plain sight. Still, the police hadn't linked the murders. Each case was being investigated in its own silo. There was no task force. No profiler. No sense of a serial killer hunting the city. But I had a feeling, a gnawing certainty, that this wasn't over. That it was just the beginning. Henry Louis Wallace had blood on his hands, but no one saw it. He wore his mask too well. And Charlotte, my city, was sleepwalking toward its nightmare. January 1993. I remember the cold that settled over Charlotte like a blanket soaked in brine, thick, damp, and clinging. I'd been writing a series on underreported murders in the city, and my editor, a tired man who hadn't smiled since the Panthers' first season, told me to drop it. There's no story here, he said. Just separate incidents. Dead ends. But I couldn't let it go. Not after I read the name Vanessa Little Mac. 25 years old. Last seen on February 19, 1993. Worked at the local convenience store. I drove down to where she lived, a small garden apartment off Monroe Road. Her neighbors hadn't seen her in days. Her car was still in the lot, keys inside. It was the staleness in the air that tipped me off before the cops even entered her unit. Vanessa was found face down, partially clothed in her own bedroom. Strangled like the others. There was no sign of forced entry. No clear sign of struggle. Nothing stolen. It was as if the killer had walked in, done what he came to do, and walked out without the wind even noticing. She had known Henry Wallace too. The connection was too strong to ignore anymore. I started pulling employment records. I cross-referenced known victims with Wallace's past jobs. Taco Bell, Bojangles, even a short stint at a local radio station. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was a web, and at the center sat Henry, cool and coiled. But still, no police report tied him to the murders. There was no database flag. No formal suspect. Just a man smiling his way through the cracks. In March 1993, the storm swelled again. Michelle Stinson, 20, a college student and mother of two, was found murdered in her apartment off East W.T. Harris Boulevard. Strangled. Her two toddlers had been left alone with her body for hours, crying hungry. A neighbor found them after hearing the older child call for Mama through the door. Henry had known Michelle too. He used to bring her food. Told people he was just helping out. Even comforted her children once when she couldn't afford groceries. That's what everyone said. He was nice. Polite. Church-going. Attentive. What they didn't know, Wallace used charm like others used chloroform. As a mask. A method. And then came Deborah Slaughter, 35. Found dead in her apartment. Strangled. A Bible sat open on her nightstand. There was no forced entry. Nothing stolen. Nothing but the eerie familiarity of the scene. When I brought the connections to a detective I trusted in homicide, he flipped through my notes, the linked names, the addresses, the common denominator. He rubbed his eyes and said, "It's thin, Carter. All circumstantial." "Thin doesn't mean false," I told him. He didn't respond, but I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt and fear. I didn't sleep well those nights. I kept imagining Wallace's face, not in anger, not in rage, but in that same soft smile I'd seen behind the Taco Bell counter. The smile of a man who helped with your bags, held open your door, gave your daughter a ride home. A man who walked among us like smoke, invisible, inescapable. By now there were 7 women, all black, all strangled, all somehow known to Henry Louis Wallace. But the city still didn't know it was being hunted, and the worst was yet to come. March 1994. The air in Charlotte had turned brittle again, like the city itself was holding its breath. I sat in my apartment downtown, a wall covered with photos, maps, and names, 10 now. 10 women, all young, all black, all strangled. Most with no signs of forced entry. No stolen items. Only one true thread, Henry Louis Wallace. I wasn't the only one who saw it now. After months of silence, frustration, and quiet outrage, whispers had finally reached the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Detectives began to quietly re-examine open cases. Some in homicide were angry. Angry at themselves, angry at the system, angry at the realization that a serial killer had been walking freely among us. Then on March 9, 1994, it happened again. But this time, it broke everything open. Brandy June Henderson, 18, was found dead in her East Charlotte apartment. Her body was still warm when officers arrived. Strangled. Assaulted. Her baby boy had been left alive beside her, crying. Again, no forced entry. Again, nothing stolen. Again, someone had seen her with Henry Wallace just days before. This time, the police took notice. The next morning, Betty Jean Bauckham, Wallace's girlfriend, was brought in for questioning. She had no idea what was happening, just that Henry hadn't come home. By then, detectives had begun cross-referencing Wallace's whereabouts. Something cracked wide open when they pulled his record. Prior arrests. Past accusations of sexual assault. 2 restraining orders. It was all there, just hidden beneath the surface. And then came Deborah and Debbie Slaughter, the final known victim. She was found murdered on March 12, 1994, only 3 days after Brandy. Wallace had gone back to the apartment he shared with his girlfriend after committing the murder, washed up, and sat down like nothing had happened. That same day, the police tracked him to a friend's apartment where he'd been hiding out. They arrested him without incident. Henry Louis Wallace was finally in custody. I was in the newsroom when the first call came in. "They got him," one of the junior editors whispered, wide-eyed. "The guy you've been screaming about for 2 years, it's him." I drove straight to the station. The press wasn't allowed inside, but I watched through glass as Wallace sat in the interrogation room, calm, composed, a soft-spoken man in a green jacket. You'd never know the monster inside him. He didn't resist. He didn't deny. And when he began talking, the floodgates burst. Over the next 12 hours, Wallace confessed to 11 murders, each one in chilling detail. He described how he'd chosen the women, how he gained their trust, how he turned on them. His voice never raised. His face never flinched. "I couldn't stop," he told the officers. "I needed it." He named each of them: Caroline Love, Sharon Nance, Vanessa Mack, Michelle Stinson, Shauna Hawk, Brandy Henderson, and more. Victims whose cases had languished in cold folders, whose mothers had buried them with no answers, whose names had almost faded from the public mind. Now they had their killer, but justice would be far more complicated. In the hours after the news broke, Charlotte erupted, not in chaos, but in grief. People gathered outside precincts. Candlelight vigils popped up on sidewalks. Mothers sobbed into each other's shoulders. Community leaders asked the hard questions. Why did it take so long? Why didn't the police connect the dots? Why didn't we matter? It wasn't just about Henry Wallace anymore. It was about what had allowed him to thrive. The silence, the neglect, the system that had turned away because the victims didn't fit the right narrative. But I wasn't done. Wallace may have confessed, but the reckoning had only just begun. In the days after Henry Louis Wallace's arrest, Charlotte didn't sleep. Not really. We were a city in mourning, yes, but also a city staring into the mirror, finally forced to acknowledge what we'd allowed to fester. Wallace had confessed to killing 11 women, 10 of them in Charlotte, all between 1992 and 1994. For 2 years, he had stalked, manipulated, raped, and murdered women he knew personally. And we'd missed it. We'd all missed it. But some people, especially in black communities, didn't believe we'd missed anything. They believed we'd ignored it. At a press conference outside CMPD headquarters, I watched a woman, Reverend Dr. Sylvia Greer, step to the podium in tears. She was the aunt of Michelle Stinson. Her voice shook, but her words hit like thunder. Had these girls been white, had they been from Myers Park or Ballantyne, we would have had a task force on day one. But these were black girls from the East Side. Poor. Some single mothers. Some with records. Easy to forget. Easy to dismiss. There was no rebuttal. She was right. I remembered the early days of the killings, how each case was treated as isolated. How media outlets, mine included, rarely used victims' photos. How police offered no warnings, no patterns, no mention of a serial killer. How people like me, reporters, accepted the official line instead of digging harder. Henry Wallace moved freely because no one took the time to truly see the women he killed. In the months following his arrest, CMPD launched an internal review. What they found was damning. At least 5 of the murders had been assigned to different detectives with no communication between them. No one had cross-referenced Wallace's name, despite the fact that many victims worked at the same places, lived in overlapping neighborhoods, and shared mutual acquaintances. They'd never created a psychological profile, never requested FBI assistance, never warned the public. Even as the bodies piled up, even as patterns emerged, the cases stayed siloed, and so the killer kept killing. The public outcry led to demands for reform in staffing, training, community outreach. Chief Dennis Nowicki held a press conference where he admitted, carefully and reluctantly, that mistakes were made. But it wasn't just the police who failed. It was the city, the media, myself included. I met with the mother of Brandy Henderson 3 weeks after Wallace's arrest. She sat across from me at her kitchen table, hands clasped, a photo of Brandy in her prom dress between us. Her eyes were dry. She'd cried herself out. I told the officer she was scared of someone, she said. I told him she said someone had followed her home. He told me to wait and see if she came back. Her voice never rose above a whisper. That same week, I visited the Wallace trial proceedings. It was early, pre-trial hearings mostly, but Wallace was already a familiar figure. Quiet, cooperative, unfazed. He wore glasses now, looked smaller. The courtroom was packed, mostly with the families of the victims. A gallery full of broken hearts. Women with faces hollowed out by grief, rage burning beneath. But Wallace? He barely looked at them. The prosecutor promised justice. A death penalty case. 11 counts of murder. Each trial to be held separately. It would take years, he said, but they'd make sure the city never forgot. Still, I wondered if the damage had already been done. Charlotte wasn't just trying Henry Wallace anymore. We were trying ourselves, and the verdict wouldn't come easy. Why, the summer of 1995, more than a year after Wallace's arrest, the city of Charlotte remained suspended in a kind of moral paralysis. The death toll was final. The confession had been made. Yet the real question, how this had happened, still gnawed at us like rot beneath a floorboard. The trials hadn't even begun. The public defender assigned to Henry Wallace was Isabel Day, a seasoned lawyer with a reputation for handling capital cases with grace, even under fire. And fire she got. Some called her a traitor for defending the devil. Others knew better. This was justice, in its rawest, most difficult form. The system must try even the worst of us, especially the worst. I sat in on the early competency hearings. Wallace was emotionless, sometimes cooperative, sometimes aloof. He spoke in even, thoughtful tones. He remembered everything, details, timelines, victims' names. No madness in his eyes. Just absence. The absence of empathy, of remorse. He didn't deny any of it. But then came the psychological evaluations, and what emerged from those documents chilled me more than his confessions. Henry Louis Wallace had grown up in South Carolina, the son of a single mother and the ghost of a father he never knew. His childhood was punctuated by poverty, violence, humiliation, beatings from his mother with electrical cords, public shaming, food insecurity, emotional abandonment. Psychologists would later testify he developed a deep, complex rage toward women, especially those he perceived as sexually independent or strong-willed, traits many of his victims possessed. One doctor described Wallace as a predator with a wounded child's soul. But childhood trauma wasn't rare in Charlotte, and it certainly wasn't an excuse. What mattered was how Wallace used that pain. He'd learned how to mimic affection, how to study people's weaknesses, how to walk into their lives unnoticed, and then strike, suddenly and cruelly, like a knife out of a warm smile. At least 5 of his victims had let him into their homes willingly. Some had even offered him food, shelter, kindness. And that betrayal, the ease with which he turned those moments into horror, was what haunted people most. He didn't kill in rage. He killed in routine. between jobs, on lunch breaks, while his girlfriend waited in the car. One day I spoke to a woman named Alicia, a former co-worker of Wallace's who'd narrowly escaped being one of his victims. She'd worked the drive-through window at Taco Bell in early '93, often alone with him after shifts. One night, she said, he'd offered her a ride home. I just felt off about it, she told me. Like his voice was too soft, too polite. I made an excuse and called my cousin to pick me up. I didn't think about it again until I saw his mugshot on the news. She paused. I still don't know if that was the night he planned to kill me. It wasn't just his actions that terrified Charlotte. It was how normal he had seemed. This wasn't the stuff of back-alley horrors or shadowed men in trench coats. This was a guy you worked with, ate lunch beside, shared jokes with, let into your apartment without a second thought. He was a phantom in plain sight. Wallace's trial was pushed back repeatedly, 2000, 2001, all the way to 1997, when it finally began in earnest. By then, he was already the most notorious serial killer in the history of North Carolina. The prosecution went forward with 9 murder charges. The courtroom was suffocating. Journalists from all over the country came to watch. The families sat in silence. Some prayed. Some clutched each other's hands. Some just stared at Wallace like they were trying to recognize the man who had once been in their homes, near their daughters. He never looked back. The prosecution played the tapes. Confessions, photos, testimony from detectives. Medical examiners detailed the brutality with clinical precision. And when the defense tried to explain Wallace's actions through trauma, head injury, depression, there were no takers. Not in that room. Not after everything. After 5 weeks of testimony and only hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Wallace was sentenced to 9 death sentences, one for each of the 9 confirmed murders in Charlotte. But as I watched him being led away in chains, I didn't feel closure. Not really. Because as monstrous as Wallace was, the holes he slipped through were made by us, by the apathy, the blindness, the refusal to see value in the lives of women who weren't rich or white or photogenic. We caught him too late. And Charlotte would carry that stain for a long, long time. Wallace was locked in a North Carolina prison cell by the time summer burned through the Carolinas in 1997. A man with 9 death sentences behind him. A face the city would never forget. But the end of the trial did not mean the end of grief. Not for the families. Not for Charlotte. Not for me. In journalism, they teach you that stories end with verdicts. I had believed that once. But after Wallace, I learned better. I met Sandra Adams in early 1998. She was the mother of Shauna Hawk, one of Henry Wallace's earliest known victims. We sat together on her porch in West Charlotte. She served sweet tea and wore a t-shirt with Shauna's face printed across it. I talk to her every day, she told me. Sometimes out loud, sometimes just in my heart. I don't know if she hears me, but I know I have to speak, so she's not forgotten. She had become an activist, speaking at schools, community centers, even inside churches where people still whispered about that man from Taco Bell. She never said Wallace's name. Not once. I don't want to give him power. I speak for Shauna. For her and the other girls. Others followed her lead. Reverend Robert Watts, whose niece had been among Wallace's victims, helped establish a community support fund for families of homicide victims. They lobbied for police reform, for improved coordination between detectives, for better public alerts when women went missing. In many ways, the families did what the city had failed to do. They gave each victim a voice, a legacy. CMPD eventually overhauled its homicide procedures. They created a violent crimes task force. They began diversity and bias training, albeit slowly. For the first time in its history, CMPD issued a formal apology, not in court, not in a press conference, but in private letters to the families. Most found it too little, too late. Charlotte changed, but not completely. Some wounds calcified, some simply scarred over. Still, I saw shifts in the newsroom. Young reporters, mostly women, mostly black, who started asking better questions, who chased the stories I hadn't chased in 1993. They saw what I hadn't. As for Henry Wallace, he remains on North Carolina's death row at Central Prison in Raleigh to this day. He has filed appeal after appeal, all denied. There is no execution date. There may never be. He spends 23 hours a day in a solitary cell, allowed 1 hour to walk in a fenced yard, alone. The state doesn't speak of him anymore. The press doesn't follow him. He exists like a shadow pinned to concrete. I've often wondered if he regrets it. Not the killing, I don't think he's capable of that, but the stillness that followed. The silence. The years ahead, stretching blank and motionless like a hallway with no doors. I don't pity him, but I do wonder. One of the most painful truths I uncovered during my reporting was that several of the victims' families had learned of Wallace's arrest and confession only through the news. No one from CMPD had visited them first. They heard it on the radio, saw it on the evening broadcast, learned at last what had happened to their daughters or sisters or wives, alongside the rest of the world. I remember one mother, Gladys Hall, who lost her niece, Caroline Love, back in 1992. She told me, "I kept calling the police for 2 years, asking if they had anything. They said no. Then one day I'm watching TV, and there he is. All the time it was him. I knew him. He was in my house, sat at my table. There was no justice for that. There never could be. The city paid no settlements, issued no proclamations. There are no statues, no plaques, no official remembrance for the women lost. But the community remembers, quietly, fiercely. Each year, on the anniversary of Brandy Henderson's death, a candlelight vigil is held outside her old apartment complex. Sometimes only a few people come, sometimes dozens. They speak their names, one by one. Shauna Hawk, Brandy Henderson, Michelle Stinson, Vanessa Mack, Caroline Love, Sharon Nance, Betty Jean Bauckham, Debbie Slaughter, Tashanda Bethia, Audrey Spain, and more, each name like a heartbeat, a memory reclaimed. Henry Wallace took so much, but he didn't erase them. Long after the media frenzy faded and the trial transcripts gathered dust in courthouse basements, Henry Louis Wallace's shadow lingered. Not because he remained on death row, many serial killers do, but because his crimes revealed an ugly, undeniable truth about who gets protected and who gets ignored. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, criminal justice scholars began referring to Wallace's crimes as an example of the missing white woman syndrome in reverse. Not a theory, a pattern. When white women go missing, news coverage is immediate, expansive, and emotional. When black women disappear, the silence is deafening. Wallace murdered 10 black women in one city, in less than 2 years, most of them within a few miles of each other. He wasn't clever. He wasn't evasive. He was just allowed to operate because no one put the pieces together or cared enough to try. I spoke at a journalism conference in 2002, hosted in Durham. The theme was bias in the crime beat. I stood on stage and admitted it. I had been part of the silence. I covered Wallace's first confirmed victim, Caroline Love, back in 1992. A 20-something black woman gone missing. No signs of struggle, no obvious foul play. The story ran once. No photo, no follow-up. We buried her story before she was even found. By the time Wallace killed again, a year had passed, and no one in the newsroom remembered Caroline's name. Not even me. The journalists who came after us, hungrier, more diverse, more relentless, kept that conversation alive. In 2004, a graduate student from UNC completed her master's thesis titled In Plain Sight: How the Media Failed the Women Killed by Henry Wallace. She interviewed former CMPD officers, editors, family members. Her conclusion was sharp. Wallace was not a phantom. He was visible. He was reported. He was investigated. But the victims he chose, poor working-class black women, made it easy for the system to overlook him. That paper changed the curriculum at several journalism programs in the South. It became required reading in some media ethics classes. I assign it to my interns now. But Wallace's case didn't just change the media. It changed how police departments approach serial crimes, especially when they cross racial and socioeconomic lines. In 2005, CMPD implemented a serial offender protocol, requiring that detectives share certain case characteristics across divisions, especially if victims fall into high-risk or underrepresented groups. Data analysis teams now flag unusual patterns faster. Would it have saved those women in 1993? Maybe not, but it might save someone tomorrow. On a national level, Wallace's case became a rare inclusion in academic books about serial homicide. Usually the profiles skew white, male, and fixated on strangers, Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy. But Wallace didn't fit that mold. He knew his victims. He chose them for emotional, personal reasons. It challenged the stereotype that serial killers only hunt strangers in the shadows. He killed the women who trusted him. There were documentaries, too. The 2004 A&E episode of The Mind of a Killer, included Wallace alongside other notorious murderers. In 2010, a short-lived podcast series tried to explore the failures of law enforcement during his killing spree. None of them truly captured the raw grief of Charlotte. They touched the surface, but the depth, that belonged to the city, and to the families. I remember speaking with Pamela Stinson, sister of Michelle Stinson, in 2006. She'd moved to Atlanta, trying to outrun the memories, but they followed her. Every time a woman goes missing here, she told me, I watch how the police respond. If they pause, if they hesitate, I feel that ache again. Because it started with Michelle, and no one listened. What Henry Wallace did was monstrous, but what the system allowed him to do, that was more frightening, because it meant he wasn't alone. He had helped, in the form of indifference, bureaucracy, and bias. Not deliberate, perhaps, but deadly all the same. The legacy of his crimes, then, is not just one of death. It's one of reckoning. It's the knowledge that evil can wear a smile and carry a time card. That justice delayed isn't just painful, it's complicit. That the stories we ignore say more about us than the stories we tell. And above all, that remembering is a radical act. To say their names, to tell their stories, to write it down not as myth, but as history. Because it happened, and it cannot happen again. Covering the Henry Louis Wallace case changed me. Not just professionally, but deeply, in ways I am still unraveling years later. When I first walked into that newsroom in Charlotte in the early 1990s, I was hungry for stories, any stories that would make a mark. But none prepared me for the slow, grinding horror of a serial killer in our own backyard. I remember the day the first victim's body was found. I was young, barely 2 years into my career. The scene was grim, but it was just another assignment, a grim routine in crime reporting. But as the bodies stacked up, the weight on my chest grew heavier. Not because I was scared of Wallace, but because I felt I was failing the women I was supposed to tell the world about. There was a constant tension between deadlines and depth, between the need to publish and the need to humanize. I saw firsthand how many stories were reduced to bullet points, to missing black woman, to drug user, to unknown suspect. The layers were stripped away, the pain minimized. One night, after filing a report, I drove through the neighborhoods where the victims had lived and worked. The streets were dark and quiet, but I could still feel the eyes of the community on me, some filled with hope, some with skepticism, some with outright anger. I realized that I was no longer just a reporter. I was a witness, a chronicler of trauma and injustice. Over the years, I've kept in touch with several of the victims' families. Each call, each meeting, is a reminder that this story is not just history, it is living, breathing pain. I recall a conversation with Marcia Henderson, mother of Brandy Henderson, who once told me, "You write it like it's over, but for us it never is. Every day, I wake up hoping it's a nightmare." That sentence haunts me, because no matter how many pages I write or how many documentaries air, the reality is that the loss remains raw. The Wallace case also taught me about the limits of the system and the power of people. The police, in their bureaucracy, missed chances. The media, in their biases, silenced voices. But the families? They became the true bearers of memory and justice. I often think about what might have been if the city had acted differently. If CMPD had connected the dots sooner. If reporters had pressed harder. If the community had felt heard earlier. But regrets don't change history. What changed me was the commitment to never forget. To keep telling these stories, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's painful. Because stories like this don't just belong to the past, they shape the future. Every time a woman of color goes missing in Charlotte, I think about those we lost. About the system's failures. About the people still fighting to be heard. And I remind myself that journalism isn't just about breaking news. Sometimes it's about breaking silence. As the new millennium dawned over Charlotte, the city stood at a crossroads. The horror wrought by Henry Louis Wallace had carved deep scars, but it also ignited a fierce determination in many corners, law enforcement, media, and community alike, to build a different future. In the years that followed, several key changes took root. CMPD expanded its cold case unit, dedicating resources to reopen unsolved murders and missing persons cases, many involving black women. Partnerships with local advocacy groups grew stronger, with monthly meetings that included police, families, and activists aimed at improving communication and trust. Community organizations like Women's Impact, founded in the late 1990s, focused on empowering young women in neighborhoods once terrorized by Wallace. They offered mentoring, counseling, job training, trying to create spaces where hope could outshine fear. I witnessed some of these efforts firsthand. Covering a women's impact graduation ceremony in 2005, I met young women who had survived violence, poverty, and neglect, yet spoke openly of their dreams for Charlotte. Their voices carried the weight of the past, but refused to be crushed by it. Charlotte also saw the rise of more diverse voices in media and law enforcement. Black and female officers joined CMPD in greater numbers. Journalists of color brought fresh perspectives, demanding accountability and shedding light on stories long ignored. It was not enough, never enough, but it was progress. Still, the legacy of Wallace's crimes lingered, a cautionary tale whispered in police precincts and newsrooms. One autumn evening in 2010, I stood outside Brandy Henderson's former apartment complex for a candlelight vigil. The crowd was smaller than I'd seen in earlier years, but the flames flickered stubbornly against the chill. Families, friends, neighbors, some I'd met over the years, stood together, saying the names once more, refusing to let silence win. As I listened, I realized something. While Wallace's violence had taken lives, it had also forced Charlotte to confront uncomfortable truths about race, class, and the value of human life, about the dangers of complacency and the cost of invisibility. Those lessons continue to echo. I still cover crime stories today, 2 decades later, and the questions remain. Who gets protection? Who gets attention? Who is allowed to disappear without a trace? The answers are evolving. Slowly, unevenly, but they are moving. Charlotte is no longer the city that Wallace haunted. It is a city scarred, yes, but also resilient, learning to listen and to act. Because in the end, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about remembrance. It's about community. It's about hope. And above all, it's about never forgetting the names that mattered. Story 3. It was the summer of 2000 in Nashville, Tennessee. A city synonymous with country music, neon-lit honky-tonks, and dreams spun from 6-string guitars and whiskey-soaked ballads. But beneath the twang of steel guitars and the shimmer of spotlight, something dark was brewing. I was working as a local reporter for the Tennessean, fresh off my college internship and eager to make a mark. Nashville was buzzing with its usual mix of tourists and musicians chasing stardom, but one case caught my attention early that year. A brutal murder that seemed to shake the city's sense of security in a way few crimes had before. It was the killing of Emily Grace Henderson, a 24-year-old aspiring singer-songwriter known in local circles for her haunting voice and hopeful spirit. She had been found dead in her East Nashville apartment on June 17, 2000. The news hit the city hard. Emily was not just another name in the crime report. She was a fixture in the music scene, a young woman with a future that now lay shattered. I remember walking into her apartment building the morning after the discovery. The usually vibrant street felt muted, like the city itself was holding its breath. Yellow police tape cordoned off the entrance, and neighbors stood clustered in small groups, whispering, some in tears. The detectives had few leads at first. Emily's body showed signs of a struggle, bruises, defensive wounds, and the scene spoke of a personal encounter gone horribly wrong. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone she trusted enough to let inside. As I began interviewing neighbors, friends, and bandmates, a picture emerged of Emily as both fragile and fiercely determined, a young woman carving her path in the fiercely competitive Nashville music world, juggling bartending shifts by night and songwriting by day. But who could have wanted to silence her? What I didn't realize then was that Emily's murder was just the first thread in a much larger, more twisted tapestry that would unravel over the coming months. A tapestry woven from secrets, jealousy, desperation, and violence that would expose some uncomfortable truths about the city I thought I knew. That morning, as I scribbled notes on a crumpled notepad, I made a promise to myself to tell her story right, to chase every lead, to give Emily Grace Henderson the voice she lost that night. The music in Nashville didn't stop for long, but for Emily, and for the city's sense of safety, it would never sound quite the same again. In the days following Emily Grace Henderson's murder, Nashville's music district felt out of tune. You could hear it in the way the guitars were strummed too cautiously at the basement, or in the silence that fell after open mic nights that once celebrated her voice. She had sung there only a week before she was killed. Her final set, a melancholy original called June Rain, lingered in the minds of everyone who had been there. By the time I returned to the basement for interviews, the staff were still reeling. The bartender, a wiry man named Sean who often watched over Emily like a big brother, poured me a whiskey and told me flat out. It wasn't random. No way. She was scared the last few nights. I saw it in her eyes. That was the first time I'd heard anyone suggest Emily might have sensed something was coming. And it changed everything. Detectives with the Metro Nashville Police Department, MMPD, were tight-lipped at first, but bits of information leaked out over those early days. The killer had strangled her, manual, not ligature. That indicated rage, intimacy, someone close. Her front door hadn't been forced. Her phone and purse were missing, but nothing else. No signs of theft, but plenty of signs of chaos. There were 3 people of interest in the early investigation. 1. Ryan Delacroix, a local musician and Emily's ex-boyfriend, with whom she'd ended a turbulent relationship 2 months prior. Ryan was known for his temper, a fact whispered in green rooms and backstage bars. 2. Terry Kinlaw, a 47-year-old landlord with a reputation for being a little too friendly with his younger tenants. 3. Danielle Reese, Emily's roommate, who had reportedly moved out just 2 weeks before the murder, citing conflict and creative differences. Rumors flew about jealousy, romantic rivalry, and a stolen song. I reached out to Danielle first. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop off 12th Avenue South. Tall, sharp-eyed, and blunt, Danielle didn't waste time with pleasantries. Emily was brilliant, but she had enemies. In this town, when you shine too bright, someone's always looking to cut your strings. She denied any feud, but I caught a flicker of tension when I asked about June Rain, the song Emily had closed with the week before her death. Danielle hesitated just a beat too long. That song was mine, she finally said. Or at least it started that way. That statement never made it into my first article. I couldn't confirm her claim, but it lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter. As the days turned into weeks, the police issued no arrests. No one was ruled out. Emily's case loomed like an open wound in the local news. People were afraid, angry. Conspiracy theories took root. Some saying it was a stalker, others pointing to a secret affair with a producer. One underground zine claimed the whole thing was a botched robbery, a cover-up involving someone higher up in the music industry. But I didn't believe in shadows. I believed in details, and there were some that kept clawing at me. Her phone had been pinged twice after the murder, once at 3:08 a.m. from a cell tower near Shelby Park, and again at 4:17 a.m. on Interstate 65, just north of the city. Whoever killed her had taken it with them, and they were moving. That meant something. MMPD wasn't saying much publicly, but my contacts inside the department, guys I'd met covering previous crimes, told me they were narrowing their focus. They had retrieved partial prints from the back doorknob, possibly left by someone trying to exit quietly. They were running DNA swabs, interviewing Emily's acquaintances, building a timeline. But everything in Nashville moved at 2 speeds, fast for music, slow for justice. I started building my own version of Emily's last day. June 16th. She had breakfast at Frothy Monkey. Worked an afternoon shift at a downtown cafe. Rehearsed at a rented studio off Dickerson Pike from 5 to 8 p.m. Multiple witnesses saw her there, laughing, singing. She was alive when she left. By midnight, she was gone. Somewhere in that window, just a few short hours, everything had unraveled. What I didn't know then was that the next clue would come not from a witness or a friend, but from a voicemail, a message the police had recovered, one that would send the entire case hurtling in a new direction. And it would change the way I saw everything that came before. It was just past noon on a sticky Tuesday in late July when I got the call. Detective Harold Minton, a veteran with 20 years on the force and a voice like gravel soaked in bourbon, had agreed to give me an off-the-record update. I'd known Minton since covering a double homicide in the Edge Hill area 2 years earlier, and we had a quiet understanding. He wouldn't lie to me, and I wouldn't burn him in print. That afternoon, he met me in the back booth of Arnold's Country Kitchen, forked some meatloaf into his mouth, and looked me straight in the eye. "We've got a voicemail," he said, chewing. "Left on her phone. Time-stamped 11:52 p.m. the night she died." I leaned in, every instinct sharpened. My recorder was off, notebook closed. He wasn't supposed to tell me this. It's a man's voice. Low, calm, almost rehearsed. Says, "I'm sorry, Emily. You were right. I couldn't let you leave it like this." Then silence. You can hear her gasp in the background. He paused. His jaw tightened. "We think that might have been the last sound she ever made." The voicemail had been left just 8 minutes before her estimated time of death. Minton didn't say how they'd recovered it, whether it was stored on a backup server or pulled from carrier records, but it was enough to electrify the case. And it put the investigation on a very specific track. The killer had confessed, at least partially, and left an audible fingerprint. The question was, whose voice was it? MMPD was now conducting voice analysis, comparing it to known individuals in Emily's life. Ryan Delacroix was brought in again, his alibi poked and prodded. He claimed he had been at a late-night jam session with 3 friends, but one had left early, and another was fuzzy on the timeline. When questioned, Ryan reportedly got defensive, angry. He refused to give a voice sample voluntarily. I reached out to him anyway. Found him at a dive bar on Gallatin Road, mid-afternoon, nursing a beer and staring at nothing. "You think I killed her?" he asked when I introduced myself. His eyes were bloodshot, but not from drink. Grief sat on him like a soaked wool coat. "She left me," he said. "She said she wanted to breathe again. I couldn't give her that, I guess." I watched him closely. Every reporter knows that sometimes the truth leaks through sorrow. But Ryan didn't flinch when I mentioned the voicemail. He didn't ask what it said. He just shook his head. "I didn't kill her," he whispered. "But I think I know who did." That sentence hit me like a slap. "Who?" I asked. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and dropped the name, Terry Kinlaw, the landlord. I hadn't expected it. Terry had been quiet, cooperative, if a little odd, but Ryan's voice hardened as he spoke. He had a thing for her. She complained about him watching her, showing up without notice. Once, he let himself into her place while she was in the shower. She told me, scared as hell. Said she was going to report him. I guess she never did. That lead sent me back into the public records office, digging for any prior complaints against Kinlaw. Nothing criminal, nothing official, but an eviction dispute with another female tenant from 1998 surfaced, one who accused him of harassment in a civil filing that was later dismissed. There were patterns, not obvious ones, but troubling. I took this back to Minton off the record. He didn't confirm anything directly, but the tightness in his jaw told me I wasn't far off. "We're not ruling anyone out," he said. "But that voicemail, it's going to tell us more than people think." The Nashville Crime Lab began working on a forensic comparison. They had access to old tenant calls from Kinlaw's leasing office voicemail, archived complaints, even a recorded housing dispute hearing from 2 years back. By August, there was movement. A subpoena was issued for Kinlaw's phone records. That same week, neighbors reported seeing unmarked cars parked near his residence. He hadn't been arrested, but the circle was tightening. And then, just when it seemed the case was about to break open, a twist landed that no one saw coming. Another woman, alive this time, came forward. She had a story to tell about a night in May, just 6 weeks before Emily's death. A night when she, too, had been locked inside her apartment by someone she trusted. Her name was Melissa Carter, and she came forward quietly. No press conference, no legal team, just a trembling voice on the other end of my voicemail at the paper. "I think what happened to that girl almost happened to me. I didn't know who to tell back then, but I do now. I met Melissa at a Panera Bread off West End Avenue. She looked worn, older than her 29 years, like the weight of her secret had aged her. She wore a navy hoodie despite the heat and refused to sit with her back to the glass window. Paranoia lives in the bones after trauma. I recognized it immediately. Her story unfolded slowly, in shivers and sharp detail. Melissa had been a tenant of Terry Kinlaw for just under 6 months, living 2 blocks from where Emily had lived. She'd moved into one of his smaller duplexes in April 2000, lured by cheap rent and a promise of artistic freedom that Kinlaw supposedly offered to young creatives. At first, it seemed like a stroke of luck. She was a painter trying to restart her life after a rough breakup. The house had charm. Kinlaw was attentive, too attentive. He brought me groceries once, without asking. Just showed up at my door with a bag and a weird grin, she said. He said I reminded him of someone. A muse, he called it. Then in mid-May it escalated. One night, she returned home from work and found the front door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen. No damage. Just unsettling. The next day, Kinlaw knocked at her door, asking if she'd felt safe lately. When she said she was considering adding a chain lock, he offered to install it himself. She declined. Then came the worst night. I came home late from a friend's place. Door was fine. Locked up. Everything normal. I went to bed. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard the floor creak. Not outside. Inside. Her voice cracked as she recounted it. She thought it was a dream at first. Then she smelled something, cologne. Familiar. A musky, artificial scent. She turned on the lamp and saw her bedroom door slowly closing. She screamed, leapt out of bed, and ran into the kitchen, where she kept pepper spray. By the time she returned, the front door was wide open. No sign of anyone. She didn't report it. She couldn't prove it. Nothing stolen. No forced entry. But she moved out the next morning. I was ashamed, she said. It sounds crazy, right? I didn't want to be another hysterical woman making a scene. When she heard about Emily's murder on the news, it stopped her cold. She recognized the building, knew the landlord. When she saw his name in the paper, her gut turned. I knew it was him. But I told myself I didn't have proof. So I stayed silent. Now, she was ready to speak. I connected Melissa with Minton and his team. She gave a full statement and allowed police to examine her old rental unit. They found no physical evidence. Too much time had passed. But her testimony offered something else, a pattern. A chilling MO. Kinlaw wasn't just creepy. He had a strategy. He offered discounted units to vulnerable women, maintained keys to all his properties, and created subtle dynamics of control. Melissa's story, combined with Emily's murder and a re-examined eviction from 1998, formed a dark portrait. Then came the breakthrough. Forensic voice comparison analysts confirmed a 90% match between Kinlaw's recorded housing dispute hearing from 1999 and the voicemail left on Emily's phone the night she was killed. The cadence, tone, and stress patterns aligned. It wasn't a conviction, but it was enough for probable cause. On August 21, 2000, just over 2 months after Emily's death, MMPD executed a search warrant at Kinlaw's home. What they found would blow the case wide open. Inside a locked cabinet in his garage was a shoebox. And inside that shoebox were personal items, small, intimate objects that didn't belong to him. A lipstick tube, a pair of earrings, a handwritten song lyric page with Emily G. scribbled at the bottom, and beneath it all, a black Motorola cell phone, powered off, wrapped in a t-shirt. Emily's phone. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus, and Nashville, for all its dreams and melodies, was forced to face the nightmare it had been harboring all along. The arrest of Terry Kinlaw happened quietly. No media frenzy. No dramatic takedown. Just 2 unmarked cars pulling into his modest brick home in the Inglewood neighborhood at 6:42 a.m. on a Friday. By the time I arrived an hour later, tipped off by a source in the DA's office, Kinlaw was already in custody. The garage door was still half open. Forensics vans sat idling in the street, and yellow tape began to stretch across his property. Neighbors stood on porches in robes, stunned. To them, Terry Kinlaw was the quiet man with a limp and a fondness for gardening. He waved every morning, kept to himself, never caused trouble. But now, Nashville was learning that monsters don't always snarl. Sometimes they knock politely. Inside the MMPD interrogation room, Kinlaw said little at first. The footage, which I later reviewed during court proceedings, showed a man calculated, composed, almost as if he had rehearsed this. For hours, he denied knowing anything about Emily's death, claimed she was just a tenant, said the items in the shoebox were planted. But the detectives had a different tactic. They showed him a photo, not of Emily, but of Melissa Carter. They read her statement. Then they played the voicemail, the tone of his voice on tape. The haunting confession. You were right. I couldn't let you leave it like this. As the recording played, Kinlaw twitched, just once. Then his hands folded into fists, knuckles whitening. She threatened to ruin me, he said quietly. She was going to the rental board. Accused me of things. She wanted everyone to know what I was. I just wanted to explain. That night, I didn't mean. It got out of hand. That was as close to a confession as they needed. The full statement, taken over 2 days, revealed a chilling premeditation disguised as spontaneous violence. According to Kinlaw, Emily had confronted him weeks earlier about his unannounced visits and thinly veiled advances. She said she planned to report him, not just to the landlord board, but to the police. He waited. On the night of June 16th, he used his spare key to enter while she was in the shower, just as Melissa had described in her own account. He claimed he meant only to talk, but when Emily screamed, threatened to call the police, something in him snapped. She wouldn't stop screaming, he said. I put my hand over her mouth, told her to calm down, but she fought. God, she fought. Kinlaw said the struggle lasted less than a minute, but in that minute, he ended a life. He panicked, took her phone and bag, wiped surfaces, locked the door behind him and drove. The phone was powered off after it pinged near I-65. He returned home before sunrise, stashing everything in the garage. The voicemail had been a mistake. He left it as he sat in his car outside her apartment, just before going in. A desperate last word, or maybe a warning to himself. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, unlawful entry, and evidence tampering. He pled not guilty at arraignment, but the mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence was damning. I remember standing outside the courthouse after that first hearing, notebook in hand, as the victim impact statements were read by Emily's family. Her mother clutched a copy of June Rain in her hands, the lyrics printed in her daughter's loopy handwriting. I was never made for silence, I was made to howl and sing. But if the night forgets me, will the morning ever bring anything? The words hung in the air long after the judge banged the gavel. Terry Kinlaw sat motionless. His eyes, for the first time, looked afraid. I wrote my front-page piece that night in one long sitting. I called it, The Quiet Man, How a City's Music Died in Silence. But the story didn't end there. There was still the trial to come. And the city, wounded and wary, was only beginning to reckon with how easily a predator had hidden behind a garden gate and a polite nod. The days following Terry Kinlaw's arrest were tense in Nashville, like the whole city had swallowed something sour and didn't know how to spit it out. Emily's murder had been tragic enough, but the revelation of who had done it, how he'd done it, felt like a betrayal. He wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. He was the man who handed you your keys, the man who fixed your faucet, the man who smiled as he invaded your life inch by inch. And once his name hit the headlines, the floodgates opened. Over the next 3 weeks, more women came forward. Not victims of murder, thank God, but victims of something that lived in the same shadow. Intrusion, intimidation, emotional control. 2 had lived in Kinlaw's units in the late 90s. One had worked for him briefly as a leasing assistant. Another had filed a restraining order in 1997 that never made it past the intake desk. Their stories were eerily similar. He watched me, always knew when I was home or not. He offered rent discounts, then started asking for dinner. I'd wake up and smell his cologne, but I lived alone. None of it had ever made it into the criminal system. Whispers, half-filled reports, warnings to friends. But now these echoes were being collected, transcribed, and finally believed. Detective Minton worked around the clock coordinating witness interviews. Prosecutors began crafting a narrative not just of a single murder, but of a pattern of predatory behavior masked as professionalism. They couldn't charge Kinlaw for the older incidents, but they could use them to build context, to show the jury the full arc of his behavior. Meanwhile, I followed the emotional debris. Emily's friends organized a candlelight vigil outside the old duplex where she had lived. I stood near the back as over 200 people, musicians, neighbors, artists, and strangers, lit candles and read her lyrics aloud. At one point, Ryan Delacroix stepped up to the mic. He looked like hell, gaunt, ragged, still carrying a grief that clung to him like soot. But when he spoke, his voice didn't waver. She was lightning, he said. She walked into a room and set it on fire. I don't know how to write music without her voice in it. Then he sang. It was the first time I'd heard June Rain live, and I'll never forget the way the words trembled as they left him. If the night forgets me, don't let it steal my name. Let the storm remember. I burned in the June rain. No one applauded. We just stood there, the candles flickering in the heat, the song curling into the dark like smoke from something holy. Later that night, I walked past Emily's old apartment one last time. The door was sealed, the windows boarded, but someone had left flowers on the step, and a note. It read, "You were not alone. Not then. Not now." The note had no name, but it didn't need one. In the weeks that followed, Nashville began to reckon, slowly, awkwardly, with the systems that had let Kinlaw operate for so long. Housing oversight boards reviewed complaint procedures. The mayor's office issued a statement promising increased protections for tenants. New city council proposals emerged around landlord background checks and key management laws. But legislation wouldn't bring Emily back. And in the courtroom, the most important reckoning still lay ahead. Kinlaw's trial was set for November 2000, and what unfolded there would expose not just one man's monstrous choices, but the quiet cracks in the city's soul that had let him go unseen. The trial of Terry Kinlaw began on a gray Monday morning in November 2000, nearly 5 months after the murder of Emily Grace Heller. I remember the first day like a photograph burned into my brain. The sea of reporters outside Davidson County Criminal Court, the cold slap of air when the doors opened, the low murmur of a city bracing for answers. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavier than outside. Tension clung to the walls, passed in glances and hushed whispers. Emily's family sat in the front row every single day, faces set in stone. Her mother wore the same black blouse each morning, as if it were armor. Kinlaw appeared dressed neatly in a navy blazer, hair combed, expression unreadable. He looked more like a high school principal than a man accused of cold-blooded murder. But it was the stillness in him that unsettled me. He blinked slow, like time didn't pass the same way for him. The prosecution opened with the voicemail. They played it for the jury. Again, I'd heard it 5 times by then, and each time, it seemed more haunting. "I'm sorry, Emily. You were right. I couldn't let you leave it like this." The courtroom was silent. No coughs, no shuffles, just that voice and the breath, the final, frightened sound of a life ending. The prosecutor, Rachel Emmett, laid out her case with surgical clarity. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. The evidence was relentless. The voicemail, time-stamped and voice-matched. The hidden box, containing Emily's personal items. The recovered cell phone, proven to be powered down hours after Emily's death. The testimony of Melissa Carter, who bravely sat before 12 strangers and recounted her own terrifying encounter with Kinlaw. The witness statements from 3 other women, read into the record as corroborating behavior. Emmett painted a picture of a man who prayed quietly, who groomed the trust of his tenants and then violated them, emotionally, psychologically, and finally physically. Kinlaw's defense team had little room to maneuver. They didn't deny he'd been at the apartment that night. Instead, they argued that Emily's death had been an accident, a tragic misunderstanding. They called it a moment of panic and poor judgment. But Kinlaw didn't testify. He never took the stand, and the jury noticed. The prosecution's final blow came with Ryan Delacroix. I hadn't expected him to testify. He'd avoided press, refused interviews after the vigil. But there he was, suit wrinkled, hands shaking as he took the stand. "She told me she was scared of him," he said. "Said he came around too much. Knew things about her schedule that she never told him." He paused, voice cracking. "She said if anything happened to her, to check the landlord first." There was a collective exhale in the room. When court recessed that day, no one spoke in the hallway. No one looked at each other. We were all thinking the same thing. She knew. She had seen it coming. And still, she hadn't been able to stop it. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The verdict came in just after 10 p.m. on a rainy Thursday night. I was there when the foreperson stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Terry Kinlaw, guilty of murder in the 1st degree. Emily's mother didn't cry. She just closed her eyes. Kinlaw showed no emotion. He turned slightly toward the gallery, as if to memorize who was watching. The judge sentenced him 2 weeks later to life without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, I remember thinking, it wasn't just Emily who had suffered. It was every woman who had wondered if she was overreacting. Every tenant who second-guessed her instincts. Every whisper never written down. Justice had come, but late, and too quietly. Still, the city had learned something about monsters, about systems, and about silence. And some wounds, once aired in the light, don't close the same way again. The day after the verdict, Nashville woke up different. It wasn't just about the headline, Kinlaw found guilty, splashed across the Tennessean. It was about something deeper, something quieter. A collective breath that had been held for months now exhaled. For some, it brought relief. For others, reflection. But no one felt untouched. At the newspaper, we worked late into the night finalizing the Sunday feature. The editors wanted it to be more than a crime recap. They wanted meaning. Something to offer to a city that had watched a dreamer be silenced in her own sanctuary. I struggled with that. What meaning was there in the murder of a 25-year-old woman whose only crime had been trusting someone with a key? Still, I tried. In the weeks that followed the trial, Emily Grace Heller became something bigger than a headline. Her story sparked a citywide movement, led mostly by young women, artists, tenants, students, who organized under the banner. Not without my voice. They demanded better protections for renters. They pushed for legislation requiring landlords to disclose previous complaints and submit to more thorough background checks. They held marches in town halls, and suddenly people started listening. The city council passed the Heller Housing Bill in March 2001. It mandated stricter access control for rental properties, including tenant control of all unit keys, mandatory security audits for landlords, and a publicly accessible complaint registry. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Ryan Delacroix went quiet again after the trial. He didn't return to the stage. Instead, he moved out of the city, rumor had it to Asheville. He sent one final letter to the paper, addressed to the editorial team. It was short. You don't recover from something like this, but you try not to waste what she left behind. Her words, her defiance, her goddamn fire. Don't let people forget. That's your job now. I never published the letter. It didn't feel like mine to give away, but I kept it. I returned one last time to Emily's old street in East Nashville that spring. The apartment building where she'd lived had been sold. The new owner planned to renovate it into upscale music-themed units, complete with a mural of famous Nashville artists. But someone had already left a mural behind. Spray painted on the brick wall near the mailbox, in looping cursive, were the final lines from Emily's best-known song. I won't be a ghost in your hallway. I'll be the song that breaks the door down. The city had been broken open. Not shattered, but changed. Some parts still ached. Some never would heal. But something had shifted. No longer was silence the default. No longer were fear and shame allowed to fester behind polite smiles and half-locked doors. Emily's story had ended in tragedy, but it had pulled others, many others, into the light. And sometimes that's the only kind of justice we get. By the time I sat down to write my long-form piece, the city had quieted, but I hadn't. Something about Emily's case had pierced me in ways I wasn't prepared to admit. I'd covered murders before, domestic disputes gone fatal, robberies turned wrong, gang shootings even. But this was different. It wasn't about a turf war or rage, or even randomness. It was about power, control, the quiet rot in the foundation of our daily lives. I'd interviewed dozens of people during those 5 months. Emily's friends, family, her neighbors, the police, prosecutors, tenants who had once lived under Kinlaw. But when I looked over my notes, I found something missing. Me. I realized I hadn't once stepped back to ask myself, why did this case feel different? Why did it crawl under my skin and stay there? So I started writing, not for the article, not for the paper, but for myself. And what came out was this. I recognized Emily's fear. Not as a woman, I'm not one, but as someone who's lived with secrets. I knew what it was to second-guess your instincts, to talk yourself down from fear because you didn't want to be dramatic. I remembered a moment years ago, early in my career, when a senior editor pulled me aside after drinks and told me I was too pretty to write crime. I laughed then, smiled, didn't report it. It felt too small. That's how it works, I realized. That's how people like Kinlaw get away with it. They chip away at you until the damage doesn't look like damage anymore. After the trial, I interviewed Detective Carla Minton one final time. We sat in her office late one evening, the blinds pulled down. She looked tired, hollow in a way only someone who's carried too many stories inside them can be. He wasn't a genius, she said. He wasn't even careful, not really. He just knew no one would question him. And for a long time, no one did. She paused, then added, "We train women to protect themselves. Lock the door. Carry mace. Don't walk alone. But who trains them for this? For a man with a key and a smile?" That stuck with me. After our interview, I stayed in the parking lot an hour, scribbling in my notebook, trying to capture the feeling that had haunted me since the first day Emily's name crossed my desk. It wasn't just about her death. It was about what we do with stories like hers. Do we consume them and move on? Or do we let them change us? When my article finally published, a 7,000-word Sunday front page spread titled "The Quiet Key: The Life and Death of Emily Heller," I didn't expect the letters, but they came. Dozens, then hundreds. From women, from survivors, from mothers, daughters, tenants, landlords. From men who said, "I never thought about it like this before." Some were angry. Others were grateful. A few were haunting. One letter came from a woman in Chattanooga who wrote, "I had a landlord like him once. Nothing ever happened, but I still remember the sound of his boots on the stairs. I never told anyone until I read your piece." Another was from a high school teacher who read Emily's lyrics to her creative writing class, then asked them to write poems about what it means to be heard. That was when I knew Emily wasn't forgotten. She had become more than a case file. She had become a voice. June 24th, 2001. Exactly 1 year since Emily Grace Heller was murdered. Nashville held its breath that morning. A new summer had come, sticky and bright, pressing down on sidewalks and shoulders like a memory you couldn't shake. And for a few hours, everything slowed. Traffic thinned. Radios went quiet. The city seemed to nod in remembrance of the girl who had once chased her dream through its streets. and whose life had lit a fuse under its conscience. That evening, they held a second vigil. Not in mourning, but in celebration. This time it wasn't on her street. It was at the Bluebird Cafe. She'd never played there in life. She'd always said she was working up to it. But that night, her voice filled the room. Ryan Delacroix returned, just for this. He played 3 songs, all of them co-written with Emily. The last was one she had written alone and never performed in public. He found it in her lyric notebook, tucked between a coffee-stained receipt and a torn-out picture of a yellow dog. It was called Still Here. He played it slowly, delicately, like it might shatter if he held it too hard. And when he got to the chorus, the entire room sang with him. I'm still here in the walls, in the wire. In the soft click of your old porch light. I'm the echo that won't retire. I'm the truth you dream of at night. No one cried. Or maybe we all did. But there was no sorrow in it, not that night. Just legacy. Emily's mother stood after the last song and addressed the crowd. She was wearing a red scarf Emily had worn in the only studio photo she ever took. My daughter lived loudly, she said. She laughed too hard and sang too long and trusted people too easily. But she was never small, and I refused to let her story shrink into just how she died. She looked at each person in the crowd, then added, let that be what you carry forward. Her defiance, her music, her fire. The crowd erupted in applause. And just like that, the girl who had once played her guitar to 3 people and a stray cat on a street corner had a sold-out tribute show in the most sacred songwriting space in Tennessee. Underscore 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 underscore. I walked home that night alone, through the same streets I'd driven in pursuit of the story. But now the story was part of me, part of all of us. Not because of the crime, not because of the horror, but because Emily had refused to be a ghost. Even in death, she had demanded to be heard. She had forced us, neighbors, friends, journalists, lawmakers, to look at the systems we let fester, to question who we protect and who we dismiss. In the end, she changed more than laws. She changed people. She changed me. And that's the thing about echoes. You think they'll fade, but the truest ones never do. They keep ringing soft and clear in every silence that follows. Still here. Still here. Still here. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. D Stories. These stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. If you've enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.